Welcome back. We recently covered true yams as a survival crop. Today we're going to cover cassava, particularly how to grow cassava out of the tropics. In the tropics, cassava is a staple. It is about twice the caloric density of a potato. It's easy to grow, it can handle drought, it can handle disease, it can handle pests. It just seems to just keep running and running and running and producing good roots that will keep you full. Like, it is super filling. If you eat a meal of cassava, you are super full. This is not like carrots or something. If you eat a meal of carrots, you wish you had more food. If you eat a meal of cassava, you feel like you ate a bag of cement. It's good. It sticks to the ribs. So today we're going to talk about how I grow it farther north from its natural range, and how those of you who are in zones 8, 9, and 10, and beyond, where it's easier, can manage to grow cassava. I'm a big advocate of having your survival food pantry in the ground of your backyard and not having to can and freeze and store. Those things are all really good, but being able to just go out to your backyard and pull roots year-round is a huge benefit, and it makes a lot of sense. You can always just continue to plant more, so you have more roots coming out of the ground on a regular basis. And this is quite possible to do in zones 8, 9, 10, and beyond, because the winter climate isn't so cold that roots get destroyed beneath the ground. And you can grow things that are a little bit tastier than turnips. So, with cassava, we first started growing it back in 2007. Man, it's been a long time. And that was in Frostproof, Florida. I got some cuttings from my friend Ralph Stuke, and he got his cuttings from some retired Christian missionaries from India who had retired to that lower central Florida area and were growing cassava in their backyard. So he got some cuttings and he said, "Have you ever grown this before?" And he showed me how they harvested it and how they peeled it, and he gave me some of my first cuttings to plant. So I made a patch of it behind the trailer that we were renting in Frostproof, and we had our little survival garden of cassava. And we figured if we had about 40 cassava plants going at any given time, that could be rotated through, like you harvest a couple one week and you pull your roots off and then you plant a few more every time you harvest, you could pretty much keep the family fed with a reasonable amount of carbohydrates all year round, because there isn't any particular time that you have to pull the roots. Once they ripen up, you can just pull them. So when they get big enough, that is. So anything from about that size to about that size is still good. And so you have a long series of months that you could pull them from. Basically over the course of a year, at any time, once they're big enough, you could dig them up and they won't be too woody. So we just continually stuck cassava in the ground. Then we moved to Tennessee and I tried to grow them there in zone 6/7 and they died. I didn't have any luck there. And then moved back to North Florida and we grew them again, and that was zone 8/9. So that was just a little bit south of Gainesville. We also planted them down in South Florida and grew them quite successfully down there, where they would just grow all year round. Now the problem is when you get into zone 8 or 9, they freeze. So how do you grow your cassava in a climate that has occasional freezes in the winter? That's what we're going to cover now. In order to plant new cassavas, you don't grow them from seed, you grow them from cuttings. That's how we started our first ones, and that's how we continue to start them. That's how they start them in the tropics, that's how they start them in zone 8, 9, etc. So you need a stick like this, and there are little buds above where the leaves were. The leaves have all fallen off this because I cut this a couple of weeks ago. And you take a piece about this big, stick it halfway in the ground, and it starts a new plant. Now the problem is they are not frost tolerant. The entire top of the plant will freeze off all the way to the ground and be destroyed, completely dead, nothing that you can plant if it goes below about 32 degrees for any period of time. So it goes below freezing, it's over. You've lost your planting material, which means you have to wait until next year, and often late in next year when the new canes have grown up from the roots that lived beneath the ground, and then you have your planting material. So what you need to do in a zone 8 or 9 climate, or if you're going to get one of those really occasional frosts in zone 10, is to cut your canes ahead of time, and then you have to keep them through the freezing months without them dying. Now they like full sun, they like warm conditions, so if you're going to put them in pots and keep them alive, you have to keep them someplace where they get plenty of sun and enough water, but not so much water that they drown, and not so cold that they can't grow at all, so they rot when you water them, right? So you want conditions pretty much in the 60s, 70s at least, and with a little bit of water, and someplace with a good amount of sun. When we tried to keep them indoors in Tennessee in pots over the 5 months or so where frost was expected, it didn't work. They died. And they looked really suspicious in my window with their palmate leaves and the light behind them that I had shining on them. So I actually had to take them out of the window because I didn't want to get raided by the police. So keeping these things through the winter is really the important part of having cassava to plant the next year. If you have to wait for cuttings and it's late in the year, you need a running start, really. Like if you're going to grow it seriously, you need a running start. So you want to be able to plant 20, 30, 40 plants in the spring and not wait for your 2 or 3 plants that you started from cuttings to grow up big enough that you can take cuttings late in the year and then plant them, and then the tops of those are going to freeze off, and then you're going to have to wait all that time. You want good established plants in the ground as soon as you can in the year, so you got to keep these canes. So today I'm going to share with you a few things that we did to keep the canes, starting with keeping them in pots. If you have a cutting about this long, it's what, 8 to 10 inches, something like that, you can stick it in a pot of soil and root it. So this one right here was probably about that long, and then we buried it into the ground, and then this bud here is growing a new cane. And we did this a couple of months ago ahead of the freezes because we wanted to have them for our plant nursery, and we also like to have a backup. Now again, remember, you need to have good light, and if you have a greenhouse, that's great, but this is obviously a commercial greenhouse for a nursery. This is way bigger than a backyard space. So when we only had a little backyard space, we always started a few in pots. We kept them on the back porch or in our sunroom, and we would bring them in when it froze, and then we'd stick them out again. Or when we had a little bitty greenhouse, we put a few barrels in the greenhouse like we have here for thermal mass, which kept the greenhouse from freezing overnight in the short frost events of North Florida and lower Alabama. This is the easiest way to start them. You just stick them right side up where the little bud is above the leaf, where the old leaves were, and you just stick them in the ground, cover them with some soil, and they're going to root. And then in the spring, you plant these out. You just cannot let these freeze or they will die till they're totally dead. But this is high effort. You have to have pots, you have to have soil, and of course you have to transplant them in the spring. There's an easier way, and it's the way we use for our mass plantings of cassava. We always do a few of these just as a backup, but our mass planting method is a little different. To keep lots of cassava through the winter, we cut long pieces like this, right? So this plant was probably 12 feet tall, and we cut some of the branches off, and we line them up, lay them into a big plastic bin or a cardboard box. We put a little bit of hay at the bottom of it, lay them on it like a little cushion, and then cover and cover and cover with more and more and more cuttings until we've stuffed that entire container full. And then I usually put another layer of hay on top just to keep a little moisture in there. And if I had a lid, I would put a lid on top of it, but the lid for this one is completely and utterly busted, so we're just putting this on top. We want them to be able to breathe a little bit. We don't want them to be too wet. The other option is to bury them in a pit in the ground, which we've done with great success in North Florida, and we did with great failure in lower Alabama. We dug a pit, put a little straw in it, laid all of our cassava canes down in there, and then put another layer of straw over it, and then we put a big piece of plywood over the top. That worked well in North Florida. We tried a modified version of that where we took a trash can and we filled it full of cassava cuttings, and we laid it on its side, and we buried it in a hill of sand. And then through the winter it was cold and rainy and rainy and rainy and rainy, and when we dug it up we found out that they had rotted. Cassava is very subject to rot when it can't grow, so if it's cool and wet it is totally going to rot. So you just stick them into something that you can put inside of your house, and chances are 4 months later you're still going to have buds on them, and they're still going to grow when you plant them out in your garden. Then you can cut pieces directly, stick them right in the ground where you want them to go, and you're off to the races without having to deal with pots and potting soil and transplanting. You just go and you cut your pieces up, stick them right where they belong, and even when we've had freezes, they've still survived inside of these boxes. A little bit of cold got into it, most of them still survived, and we still had plenty of planting material for the spring. Now, talking about things being too wet or being too cold, here is something we tried. You might think, hey, look, I've got some water here. I've got some water in my greenhouse, or I've got some water on my porch or in an outbuilding or something. What if I just stuck them in a bucket of water like you might do with cuttings of something else, like sugar cane? Maybe I'll just stick them in there and they'll root. Well, I found when we did this through the winter, I had a barrel, and I stuck some of them in the bottom of the barrel, so there was about that much in the water. The entire bottom of it just turned to goo, and the skin sloughed off, and it just was disgusting and terrible. The top of it actually stayed mostly alive because it was humid in the greenhouse, but it doesn't work well. It's better to just put them into something. Now, another method that did work, a friend of mine took a bunch of cuttings and stuck them into a black trash, like lawn and leaf bag, and he put that into his carport, and he just forgot about it. And then in the spring, he's like, what is this trash bag? And he opened it up. He's like, oh yeah, I forgot, I left those cuttings out there. And he sent me a picture, and all of these little sprouts were coming out of them, and they were all blanched white. And he just took them and he planted them out, and he had ready to go cassava. So that's another option. You could just put them in a trash bag. I would just make sure that it's not too moist inside, because they will totally cover in mold and rot. They do not like it cool and moist. Another option, if you have a mild climate, and this worked well for us in North Florida, it did not work well for us in Alabama, but your mileage may vary, is to simply dig a spot where you want to put in a cutting in the fall when it's going to be freezing out, and plant them rather like you would plant a sugar cane. Lay it on its side, cover it up, and then remember where it is. And then in the spring, it'll grow out of the ground. We've done this without even mulching over it in North Florida, and we had good luck with them coming back. Now, if you do mulch over it, you're gonna have to remember that and pull the mulch back in the spring, or it may not come up. Now, what's happened here in Alabama is that generally when we've done this, they simply rotted in the ground. Occasionally they would come up, but often they would rot because we have wet winters here. And in North Florida and South Florida, there are drier winters. So that wet and cold rotted it in the ground, and it didn't come back. So it may be that it works, and sometimes you might end up with a season where it's actually going to work really well for you, but other times it is simply not. So we don't do that here. We don't trust it after trying it and losing a bunch of cuttings that way. One last option for keeping your canes is to do it the Brazilian style that was shared with me, where in Brazil, in areas with light frosts, they would stack up their cuttings against the side of a tree and just throw a little brush over the base of them and bury a little bit of soil around the bottom of the cuttings, lean them up against the east facing side of a tree, and just throw some brush and stuff over them. I have a little short on that I will link to so you can see it. But we tried that, it did well, except that we had a really, really cold winter, so some of them survived, and I think it would have survived a lot better otherwise. When we've cut our canes and taken them inside, these are what's left. I leave a little bit of trunk over the ground. I don't cut them all the way down to the ground, and then I just go like this and put some sort of mulch material over it. This is old hay that was not sprayed with anything. You can use fall leaves. You could probably even use, just mounding it up with more dirt would be fine, because the frost events don't freeze the ground hard here. So a little bit of cover. These are going to resprout in the spring. So each one of these mounds is a cassava plant that I didn't think the roots were big enough on. So I just went ahead and covered them. And then the next year, by the fall, they will be in good shape to pull and harvest. Cassava is just an exceptionally good staple crop if you are in the climate to grow it. I cover it in Florida Survival Gardening, Totally Crazy Easy Florida Gardening, in the new version of Create Your Own Florida Food Forest, in the South Florida Gardening Survival Guide, and all over my website, because after years of growing cassava, I'm sold on it, and I've tried to figure out how to grow it in whatever climate we've been in. And so far, the best we've been able to manage was Zone 8. We've grown it in Zone 8, we've grown it in Zone 9, we've grown it in Zone 10, 11, and in the equator, like right near the equator. So it's become a big part of our diet and part of our survival long-term food bank in the ground. And so if you can grow it, please do grow it. And you often can't get cuttings throughout the year. Cuttings are not easy to find unless you're getting them, you know, from a tropical location. So my daughter will have some cuttings in her Etsy store. That's the Good Gardens Etsy store. I'll put a link to that below if you want to try it. But you're going to have to figure out how to keep them through the winter if you have frosts, and one of these methods should help you. And of course, you know, you can read more for free on my website. You can also watch some of my other videos on how we plant it and how we harvest it. And I just actually recently posted on how my wife cooks it. So I'll put a link to everything that I can find on cassava. And you know, thanks for watching. I think you'll enjoy it. It's another one of those survival crops that's, you know, not particularly well known inside of the United States, but is well worth growing. So catch you guys later. Until next time, may your thumbs always be green.